ClancyPasta presents Rebirth, written by Sammy Scott. Son, come outside with me. Let's have a talk. My dad catches me in the hallway outside my bedroom, or what used to be my bedroom before I went away to school. Weeks into my freshman year, my mom had converted the room into a home office for herself, my dad already having one of his own down in the basement. I half expected her to turn it into a scrapbooking station, but then again, Mom has never been the sentimental type. Anything I had left behind, like the posters on the wall and most of my furniture, was promptly removed, relocated to the attic as far as I know, and replaced with a beautiful oak office set. She did allow enough space, however, for a small cot tucked away in one corner for my occasional weekend visits, those times when I got a little homesick or my laundry had become mountainous. I follow my dad through the screen door and out onto the porch. The morning sun stabs my eyes. He sinks down into a rocker and gestures for me to do the same. There is a bite to the fall air, and I wish I was wearing more than a thin blue t-shirt and jeans. Dad has donned a thick coat, which is probably providing more warmth than necessary, yet I am sure he is currently more comfortable than I am. I consider ducking back inside for a sweatshirt. Dad reaches down to the left of his chair, and I hear the rattle of ice and the clink of glass. He pulls 2 bottles of beer from a hidden cooler with one hand, uncaps them, and offers me one. "Happy 21st birthday, Jeffrey," he says, and I take a bottle with a smile. It's cold and wet against my already chilly fingers. We clink the necks together and take a swig, both of us turning to face the expansive yard behind the house, acres of unblemished land that ends in a line of distant trees. The only thing between us and that vast expanse of woods is a giant solitary elm. I used to climb that elm. I kissed my first girlfriend under that elm. "Thanks, Dad," I say. "How is it?" he asks. "It's good," I lie. This isn't my first taste of beer, and I'm sure my father knows this, but I don't care the taste, and I'm not sure I ever will. Somehow I think he knows this as well, but 21 is a milestone, and what better way to celebrate it than sharing a cold one with your old man on the back porch? "Where's Mom?" I ask. The morning is late, and I realize I didn't see her on her way through the kitchen. She's not a morning person, and is typically not up before I am. A sad but intelligent and caring woman, she's also prone to depression and sleeps a lot. "She ran out while you were sleeping," Dad says, placing his beer on a small table between our chairs. "Be back in a bit." We sit in silence for a moment, the only sound the breeze rustling through leaves that will soon be relenting their grip and make their final bed collectively on the ground. "Jeff," Dad says with a sigh, not looking at me. "You're 21. You're a man now. There's a conversation I've been needing to have with you, but I wanted to wait until today." "Dad, I know where babies come from," I say, and I crack a wide smile at him. He gives me a sidelong glance and, after a pause, grins back, but it's a tired smile born mostly of obligation. This is obviously no time for joking, and I wish I could retract my comment. He looks away from me and out over the yard. He looks old to me, much older than his 55 years. His hair is gray and thin and mostly gone except at the temples, a fate that I wonder may someday befall my currently thick brown locks. And in the overcast autumn sunlight, there are deep shadows in the creases of his eyes and mouth. He looks forlorn. "You don't know this, Jeffrey, but 25 years ago, I worked for the CIA. This is not the opening line I expected, and I consider for a moment whether or not my father is kidding. All of my life he has worked as a banker, a successful one at that, but certainly not a job with the kind of prestige and intrigue of a CIA agent. It's unbelievable to me, and yet, in the same instant, I can totally picture him in the role. Suit, tie, dark glasses, 25 years younger and in full agent mode. It's something I never would have guessed, but can somehow easily imagine. He certainly has the intelligence and demeanor for the role." "Okay," is all I say, wanting him to continue. My friends and family knew I worked for the government, but not exactly in what capacity. I couldn't even tell your mother a lot of what I saw or even where I was going at times. I was let in on a lot of secret stuff that most people have no idea about. A lot of it you don't want to know. He shakes his head rapidly as he says this. Ignorance is bliss and all that. He picks up his beer and takes another swallow. I clutch mine tightly, but didn't drink it. I'm watching my dad. He's watching the yard. About a year or so before I joined, the government became aware of a doctor in California. Albert Kimball was his name. He was the most successful plastic surgeon in California. He was making millions of dollars performing miracle work on some of the most famous faces in Hollywood. Before him, there were plenty of starlets who saw their careers ruined by botched plastic surgery. This was before your time, but back then, actresses in particular would have work done in order to salvage both their looks and their careers. And in the end, they'd end up looking, well, not natural, really. They'd have no wrinkles, but they'd also be left with a face that just didn't belong in nature. Not completely. And then their careers would be over. Ironic, really. Anyway, along comes Kimball, and he quickly gains quite the reputation as a plastic surgeon with a miracle touch. It was nearly undetectable. He could take 10 years off a person's face, and none of it looked artificial. He was almost like an artist in that regard. It was no wonder he became hugely successful. He became the most sought-after surgeon in town and could demand just about any price. But Kimball wasn't satisfied, you see. He knew deep down that all he was doing was putting a shiny new coat of paint on cars that had 200,000 miles under the hood. The outsides looked young, but they didn't have the insides to match. You can make a 60-year-old man look 40, but that man would still run, punch, and walk like he was 60. That just wouldn't do it, as far as Kimball was concerned. As it turned out, Kimball was brilliant beyond plastic surgery. He knew chemistry, physiology, biology, DNA. There are those who ultimately came to believe he might have been the most brilliant mind of his time. He began working on a formula, a process that didn't stop at the appearance of restoring youth. He wanted to actually restore youth. And wouldn't you know, he figured it out. Dad shakes his head and chuckles quietly. I study him, part of me wondering if this still might be a joke. It took him a while to really perfect it, Dad continues. He came up with this process, this series of injections and ingestions combined with external chemical applications. Needless to say, it was a very complicated formula, but the results literally turned back the hands of time, all without ever touching a blade to skin. He wasn't even fully aware of the power of what he had created. Not at first. He applied it very sparingly, small doses that would erase wrinkles from faces, tighten up sagging skin, erase age spots. These weren't very exciting results, of course. He could achieve much the same thing with a scalpel. But as he became more confident in his formula and its absolute lack of any negative side effects, he began to slowly increase the dosage and potency. He knew the results went beyond the surface when he watched gray hair turn dark again. Soon he had patients whose eyesight and hearing improved. Bone density and muscle mass increased. Rattling old voices began to sound young again. Postmenopausal woman got pregnant. He had truly discovered how to turn back the hands of time within the human body. He called it the FOY formula, F-O-Y, Fountain of Youth. And once he began offering it to his richest clients, there was no keeping it a secret, no matter how many non-disclosure agreements were signed. He went from servicing Hollywood A-listers to treating every billionaire entrepreneur and high-ranking political official in the country. Not only because he could restore youth, but because of the unintended but incredible side effect. He could cure disease. Think about it. Alzheimer's was eradicated. Arthritis, heart disease. Were you diagnosed with cancer in your 40s? No problem. Kimball could de-age you to your 30s and the cancer would disappear. This was a world-altering discovery. Dr. Albert Kimball was on his way to becoming one of the most famous and celebrated men in history. And yet, you've never heard of him, have you? I shake my head. No. I was never the best student, my grades often a cause for my dad's disapproval, but I would remember a man like this. Of course you haven't. In 2022, right around the time I was getting my security clearance, Kimball became the US government's #1 POI. What Kimball had at first seen as a breakthrough in cosmetic surgery and later as a medical miracle, the government saw as a Pandora's box, an imminent threat that needed to be immediately regulated, controlled, and concealed. The government saw a gold mine, but they also saw a minefield. Why? I ask. One simple reason, and it wasn't the expense of it. It didn't take long for the country's top scientists to synthesize the formula until it became shockingly cheap to reproduce. No, the danger was something else. The Foy formula reversed the aging process and restored youth, but it didn't stop aging from resuming once again. A 60-year-old woman could become 20 again, but in 40 years she'd look 60 again, even though she would actually be 100 years old. But there would be nothing stopping her from taking the treatment again, barring external circumstances like a car accident, a murder, or a suicide. The entire treated population would become essentially immortal. If the government were to subsidize the Foy formula and offer it to everyone, nearly the entire US population would become eternal 20-somethings. Death rates would plummet, and simultaneously, birth rates would skyrocket. Within a generation, the planet would die from overpopulation. A world of vibrant young people would all perish at the hands of famine and war. There were months of closed-door conversations within the government on how best to utilize Kimball's discovery. Most of these conversations revolved around the issue of morality. In an effort to offer the life-saving benefits of Foy without running the risk of overpopulation, it was suggested that all those who enrolled in some kind of government-run Foy program would have to necessarily agree to be sterilized in the process. If you wanted youth and immortality, you had to agree to never bear children. But that really wasn't a solution at all. You see, people aren't meant to live forever. There was a fear that a never-ending cycle of youth restoration, all the while being surrounded by the same people who also never aged or died, might lead to a worldwide depression the likes of which we had never seen and would never recover from. Similarly, there was the question of whether it was morally right for those who were fortunate enough to be alive at the birth of Kimball's discovery to essentially snuff out the existence of future generations. Was it selfish for the adults of 2022 to permanently lay claim to their place on this planet at the expense of the children of tomorrow who would never come to be? And what future discoveries, what future creations, what future progress would never come to fruition because we never allowed for the birth of future scientists, future artists, or future visionaries? These were the questions elected officials were volleying behind closed doors. In the end, the government took full control of the Foy formula, not only its uses and applications, but also the dissemination of information. Those who had become aware of Foy early on, those clients of Kimball's who were lucky enough to buy into the process before Uncle Sam sunk his fingers into it, were given substantial payoffs to keep their mouths shut. Those who refused to comply were summarily disappeared. If you were to look back at some of the biggest box office stars of 2022, you'd note a good number that dropped off the radar completely in 2023. Retired overseas, died mysteriously, etc., etc. Those were the ones who flatly refused to keep their mouths shut over a sense of liberal goodness, the idea that recyclable youth should be made available to the hoi polloi. For the rest of the public, the Foy formula was considered a conspiracy theory for a while. Any journalist worth their salt who dug into the rumors that an LA plastic surgeon had somehow created the fountain of youth was humiliated or, at most, given the official line that while it had one time appeared that scientists were on the brink of a groundbreaking anti-aging cocktail, in the end the side effects had, regrettably, proven to be catastrophic. Eventually, any fires that Kimball had lit were snuffed out. The government's disinformation campaign was successful, and soon any inkling of the Foy formula completely disappeared from the public consciousness. Whatever happened to Kimball? I ask. Dad shrugs. I honestly don't know. I was told that he was shipped off to a private tropical island staffed by 100 beautiful women and an unending supply of his own formula to live for as long as he so chose. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But I can't help but wonder if Kimball himself was one of those fires that the government decided better not stay lit. I'd like to imagine he's on a white beach somewhere, sipping a bright red drink and looking at crystal blue water, tanning his 20-something body, but who knows. Dad sips his beer, I do the same. Anyway, that's not the end of the story by any means. Over time, the government discussed how best to continue to use Kimball's discovery. Firstly, they decided to continue to make it available to the richest people across the world. Money still talks, of course. Those with the deepest pockets were allowed to turn back the clock in exchange for huge sums of money, absolute secrecy, and their own fertility. If you wanted to live forever, you weren't allowed to be adding to the population. Those were the terms. And those with famous faces had to agree to retire from public appearance before any suspicions rose. Celebrities were allowed to de-age 5 or 10 years in order to extend their careers by a decade, but after that, they had to go away. We couldn't have 50-year-old actresses vying for the roles of 20-year-old starlets. People would ask questions. So, the choice was either extended youth or lifelong celebrity. You could not have both. Secondly, there was a select group of people, the world's greatest minds, the most prominent and influential leaders, those who had, in the government's flawless and unbiased opinion, contributed the most to society in their lifetime. These people were given access to the treatment if they so chose. Some accepted and were given access to an island like Kimball's. Somewhere out there in the tropics is a secret place populated by a who's who of the world's past elite, all of them young and ostensibly immortal. But it should be noted that some of the great minds passed on the opportunity. Some of them recognized that mortality is a necessary facet of life itself. A noble decision, if you ask me. I nod in agreement. I get it, but I wonder which choice I would make in the same situation. Thirdly, the government has selectively continued to offer the formula for its curative properties. Again, it's an exclusive list, one our names would never appear on. If a member of royalty comes down with Alzheimer's or a lifelong member of the deep state gets cancer, small doses of foy are administered, just enough to regress the patient back a sufficient number of years before the disease first took root. But it's not for the masses. It's all who you know. That's just wrong, I say. Of course it is, Dad agrees. But imagine being the person in position to decide who does and who does not have access to the fountain of youth. Would you deny it to your own mother if she had cancer? Of course not. But don't act like you'd make it available to every single person alive, knowing full well the global impact an undying population would have. I think for a moment. I don't know. It sounds to me like the government made a lot of decisions based on projections. Maybe their projections were wrong. Maybe, Dad says. But I've had many years to mull it over, and in the end I feel it's best that if they erred at all, they erred on the side of caution. Dad is silent for a moment. The breeze picks up and my arms break out in goose flesh. I cross my arms and, for a moment, consider again suggesting that I go inside for a jacket. But then Dad gets up suddenly from his rocker, his hands in his coat pockets, pulling it tighter against his body. "Let's walk," he says, going down the porch steps. I follow without objecting. Out from under the shade of the porch, I am hit by the rays of the late morning sun, and my skin warms. Dad walks in a straight, slow line toward the distant trees. I can just barely hear the breeze whispering through the branches, the trees swaying in a lazy dance. Dad takes a deep breath through his nose. But now I'm getting to the real point of our conversation. There was a fourth application of foy, a use that the government has managed to keep completely secret for more than 2 decades now. And it's a subject you would never even begin to guess would be tied to a veritable fountain of youth. I am, of course, immensely curious, and perhaps that's why Dad draws out a long pause. I don't even wager a guess. Capital punishment, he says. I am puzzled and smile in confusion. What? I ask, a chuckle in my voice. It started off as just an interesting suggestion, an off-the-wall comment in the midst of many closed-door conversations concerning the morals of the application of FOI. See, in the end, Kimball and the scientist who synthesized and improved upon his formula didn't just stop at the erasure of a few decades. They continued to push the limits of how far they could go. At first, yes, they discovered that senior citizens could become 20-year-olds again, but then adults could become teenagers, then children, then infants, eventually young enough to no longer be able to survive outside the womb. Apply enough of the formula, prolong the process, and in the end they learned there was no limit to the de-aging process. You're kidding, I say, incredulous. I am not, Dad responds. They could literally turn an octogenarian into a fetus, into a fertilized egg, into nothing. My jaw drops and I stop walking. We have reached the giant elm in the middle of the yard and I am cold again in its shade. There is a bald spot underneath one great branch where a tire swing used to be. A tire swing I spent many an hour on during childhood summers, but all that remains of it now is a broken and rotting rope. I picture myself swinging there, waving to Mom as she sat alone on the distant porch, watching over me. Sometimes she didn't wave back, even though I was sure she had seen. Dad has continued to stroll, so I jog to catch up. He continues talking as if he hadn't noticed he had briefly left me behind. In one of many spitballing sessions, it is suggested that perhaps the FOI formula could be given to criminals on death row. Ridiculous, right? Why restore youth to the nation's worst criminals? Well, the thought is that perhaps the FOI formula would answer the question of whether or not capital punishment is moral. Are we in fact killing a man if we simply de-age him from existence? It was an interesting question, but of course one of the main purposes of capital punishment is deterrence. We execute criminals in an effort to de-incentivize possible future criminals, right? But since the FOI formula was top secret, we couldn't tell the world we had come up with a more moral way of executing criminals. If we went down that particular road, we would have to outwardly communicate that execution was still happening while secretly de-aging the worst offenders into non-existence. In essence, it would only work to assuage the consciences of those who have to flip that fatal switch or administer that lethal injection. It was a minor difference at best. But soon the conversation switched to something else. Soon we began having debates concerning nature versus nurture. What if instead of either executing death row inmates or de-aging them from existence, we simply returned them to childhood? And then what if those children were placed in adoptive households handpicked by the government? Households run by parents could provide these children the kind of positive, balanced upbringing that might put them on the correct path not offered to them the first time around. It's an interesting idea, right? Dad asks me, and I have to agree. So I nod. And that is exactly what we began to do. Men on death row, thinking they were about to receive a lethal injection, were instead given a general anesthetic to put them to sleep. They were then administered heavy doses of the FOI formula, de-aging them to infancy. These children were then placed with adoptive parents who had been pre-screened as prime candidates for being able to provide a healthy, balanced upbringing. Of course, these parents had no idea we had just given them a son, or in rare cases, a daughter who was a convicted murderer. Imagine looking into the beaming faces of these young new mothers and fathers as they embraced with joy these baby monsters. It never sat well with me. But eventually we took it even further. We began regressing the criminals to the fertilized egg stage and implanting them in women who had sought out in vitro fertilization. We'd find a couple who looked like a physical match to these killers. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed criminal would go to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed couple, for example, and instead of implanting the mother with her own egg fertilized by her husband's sperm, we'd give them the fertilized egg that was actually once a death row inmate. Dad shakes his head. I still can't believe we did that, but there was no shortage of couples willing to participate. It was a government-funded program, free adoption or free in vitro fertilization to a select group of couples that we thought might put these criminals on the right path, beginning all the way back at childhood again. We didn't leave these couples to flounder, of course. The children were given the best education, the best healthcare, and regular psychiatric evaluations, all on the government's dime, of course. The couples were none the wiser. They were so happy to either finally give birth to a child of their own or be able to adopt one, all free of charge, that they didn't ever question why we were making their dreams come true, and the children themselves never had any memory of their former wretched lives. But as the children got older, I say, didn't anyone ever look at their kid and think, wait, he looks exactly like that serial killer I read about years ago? Of course not, Dad responds. Nobody sees what they don't want to see, and honestly, aside from some of the most famous serial killers in history, how many death row inmates would you recognize on sight? We were smart enough to relocate these children to states where they were never likely to run into someone they knew in their adult lives, so there was never any recognition. It's also hard to believe, I say. We called it Project Rebirth, Dad says. Even the name was designed to make us feel better about what we were doing. We were giving children to childless couples. We were giving society's worst a second chance at life. And we were not, as some people argued, exacting merciless revenge by executing criminals. It all sounds wonderful, and I know it gave some of my colleagues the warm and fuzzies, but I didn't like it. Not from day one. I knew deep down what we were doing was placing monsters into the hands of oblivious couples. And I know we don't agree on this, Jeff, but I still believe in justice. The minute a man devalues another person's life to the point of taking it, he has given up the right to his own life. It's that plain and simple. Eye for an eye, I offer. Exactly, Dad says, his voice filling with sudden emotion. I believe that even before that scum killed your grandmother and grandfather in cold blood. For $75 and a pearl necklace. Those were two wonderful people that you don't know because a junkie decided money for his next hit was worth more than some couple whose names he never even knew. We've reached the tree line. Both of us stop walking. The house is a small box in the distance behind us. Dad sniffs. I pat him on the back. He wipes his nose on the cuff of his coat. I only kept that job for about 2 years after Project Rebirth was introduced. I couldn't stomach it. It went against everything I stood for. I got paid really well, and I worried about what I might do next, how I might support your mom without it. But then my mom and dad got killed, and that rat that pulled the trigger got convicted. He was publicly put on death row, but covertly put on the list for the Rebirth program, and I walked away. I couldn't take it anymore. There I was, mid-30s, robbed of two of the most important people in my life, and that monster was given a second chance in life. A second chance at youth. A second chance at happiness. Where was their second chance at life? Where was their second chance at happiness? Or mine? I wouldn't stand for it. I walked away. A sob hitches in Dad's throat, and I put my arm around him, pulling him closer. But he is stiff and resists my embrace, still facing the trees, so I let him go. In the end, though, wasn't some of it worth it? I ask. I mean, those kids in different households with different parents, did they turn out better? Did nurture win over nature? He nods, clearing his throat. Most of them, yes. I mean, I didn't work there anymore, but I still had buddies on the inside who would give me updates. Guys who agreed with me that the system was wrong, but kept their jobs because the pay was so good. They would tell me how things were going. Most of the kids turned out better, much better. A few of them, particularly ones with genetic predispositions toward mental issues like schizophrenia, became problematic, but the doctors were able to watch out for it and deal with them early, with medication and therapy. Only a few of the children had to be removed for the parents' safety. Most of them turned out okay on the second go-round. So it's not all bad, right? I say, patting him on the back reassuringly. You did a good thing. Turning these criminals into good people was a good thing. Yes, he says, nodding again slowly. We did a good thing, which makes this next part so much harder. Dad takes a step away from me, almost casually, and faces me for what I realized is the first time in almost our entire conversation. It takes me a moment to notice he is no longer holding his coat tight against him, but instead he has drawn a pistol from a pocket and is pointing it directly at my chest. His hand is trembling. My entire body goes numb with a chill that is coming from deep inside of me. I can't feel my hands or feet. Even though I quit that job, there were those still working within the program who agreed that it wasn't right. It wasn't right for a man to take someone else's life, and their punishment, if you want to call it that, is to be given a literal start over in life. Where's the start over for the people who died, or for the loved ones they left behind? Dad, I say, and my voice is shaking. What are you doing? Those buddies of mine stood with me when my parents got lowered into the ground, and they knew the right thing to do. Sure, they argued with me at first. They tried to reason with me to talk me out of it, but they came around eventually. And if anybody knows how to do things covertly, it's the boys in the Rebirth program. I put up my hands and took one step away from my father, a man who was always such a good provider but emotionally distant, a familiar presence and yet in so many ways, a stranger. Please don't do this, I plead. They gave you to me and your mom 21 years ago today, your rebirth day. I wanted to end you then and there, quick, like a band-aid. But your mother, she insisted. He's just a baby, she said. So I agreed to wait. I agreed to wait until I could look into the eyes of the man who murdered my parents. I shake my head, searching my thoughts, trying to conjure memories, but I come up empty. Dad, don't. You can't do this. Yes, I can, he says. An eye for an eye. I want you to know, their names were Wallace and Eleanor. They would have been amazing grandparents if your mom and I had ever had children. But you killed them for $75 and a necklace. You pitiful excuse for a human being. He spits this last sentence and looks at me with an anger I have never seen in his eyes before. Dad, don't, I say, my heart pounding in my throat. I don't remember anything. But I do, and I always will, he says, and he aims the gun between my eyes, his hand suddenly steady. Your mother said to tell you that she loves you. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I want to give a huge thanks to all of my supporters over at Patreon and YouTube memberships. Your support makes these narrations possible, and I appreciate it a ton. If you'd like to join these lovely ghouls, you can head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/ClancyPasta, or click the join button below to become a member. And if you'd like creepy cool shirts, make sure to head on over and check out my official merch store for some awesome tees, hoodies, stickers, and more. Alright. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great night. Cheers.